Everybody, we have a couple of people yet to arrive, but we're going to go ahead and start and try to keep on time. My name is Faye Henning Bryant, and I have the honor of chairing the Adult Education Committee here at Temple Beth Shalom, and we welcome everybody this morning. I have a couple of voting questions just to get a feel for our group before I introduce the rabbi. How many of you here are not members of Temple Beth Shalom? Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's great to see you here. How many of you, this is your first Adult Education Committee here at Temple Beth Shalom since before COVID? All right. Good. How many of you, if this is your first Adult Education meeting or course ever here at Temple Beth Shalom? Good, thank you. How many of you have been to Israel? How many of you have not been to Israel but would like to go to Israel? Wonderful. We're talking about a trip next year. Well, with that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Those of us who are members here take our rabbi and his knowledge and expertise very much for granted, and we often don't recognize what the extensive background that he has. But Rabbi Dana Evan Kaplan actually did his rabbinic studies in Jerusalem rather than one of our campuses in the United States, and stayed on and did his PhD in Israel as well, and then left Israel for 20-some years before he went back in the summer of 2022 to study. And I think he'll tell you about some of the differences that he saw. Rabbi Kaplan has been a pulpit rabbi his career. He's had congregations in Australia, South Africa, Georgia, Jamaica, the island of Jamaica, not Jamaica, New York, and Alabama, and now he's ours. And he is very, very helpful to the Adult Ed Committee, and we're very fortunate to have him as our speaker this morning. So I'd like to introduce you to Rabbi Kaplan.
Thank you, Faye. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Or did you hear her better? No, you can hear me. You can hear me well.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So good morning. So yes, as Faye said, I studied in Israel in the early 1990s, which seems just a few months ago, but it turns out it's many years ago. And Israel was a fairly primitive country at that point. Then I left in 1994, and I didn't go back except for a one-week mission trip during the Second Intifada. I don't count that because it was 1 week, and I didn't know what country I was in the whole week I was there, because they took us around from 4 in the morning till midnight every day, and we were in and out of the country before I realized it, but for 28 years. And then when I came back in 28 years to the country, it was like Rip Van Winkle. Did the sound change? Oh, okay.
It's going in and out.
It's going in and out. Well, is this better? This is better. That's what I thought originally. So, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. And so I went back in 2022 to study at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. It was my first time in 28 years that I'd been back. It was like, at first, it seemed like a completely different country. The restaurants were very, very elegant, and the food was unbelievable. And people seemed more polite, a little bit more polite, which was almost unbelievable to me. But by the time I left, 4 or 5 weeks later, I saw that underneath it all, it really had the same culture, the same mentality, and perhaps was getting worse. And then I went back a year later, just 1 year later, and it was like, again, a completely different country. Everything, the first time I went, it was the startup nation, and everybody looked very happy, and the high-tech boom. And just a year later, which is this summer, everybody was in middle of a tremendous fight. You know, there was like very high angst, and there were protest rallies all the time, and there was people shouting in the streets, "Democratia, democratia, we want democratia, don't take away our democratia." It was like, I couldn't believe it. So, but I want to start in the principal thing that they're fighting over is what they call judicial reform. And the current government is trying to push through this changes to the legal system. So how many lawyers do we have here?
He's enough.
Leonard is our lawyer, and he's got a good law degree from a prestigious law school. And I'm telling him I'm going to go to law school in my spare time, and we could start a practice together. But he has really discouraged me from doing that. So I don't know what the future will hold. But a lot of it involves fairly specific legal issues that I'll try not to get into. But one of them is just sort of almost funny, and that is that the concept of reasonableness. So the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Barak a number of years ago, introduced the concept of reasonableness. So there's the Knesset, which is the parliament or the Congress, and they have a what is it, 120 members. So to have a majority, you need to have 61, and they can pass laws. And then the Supreme Court said we can nullify a law if we don't think it's reasonable. Now, what is reasonable? So I brought the definitions. As a legal norm, it is used for, quote, for the assessment of such matters as actions, decisions, and persons, rules and institutions, and also arguments and judgments. And as a regulative idea, it requires that all factors that might be relevant in answering a practical question be considered, and that they be assembled in a correct relation to each other in order to justify a decision. So basically, the Supreme Court in Israel could say, you passed a law, for example, saying that red-haired people cannot vote. Okay, so this is really a case that I had from an article that I'm taking Hebrew classes actually with a great Hebrew tutor on Preply, which is one of those online language instructors, and my teacher is a lawyer, an Israeli lawyer, and she gave me this article to read from, and in Hebrew, so I could practice. And the article has a guy that it kind of to be funny partly, and partly to just give an extreme example, says, what if there was a law saying that that people with red hair? Do we have anyone here with red hair?
I was.
Ed, right? Ed is claiming to be a red-haired.
I used to have red hair.
You used to have red hair. Me too. Oh man. See, some questions are just become so sensitive to ask, and you don't think that they'd be sensitive. But anyway, the example in the article was that the Knesset would pass a law discriminating against, or say taking the vote away from red-haired people, or people who used to have red hair, as we refer to them here. And so that would go to the Supreme Court, would look at that law and then say it's not reasonable, right? It's discrimination based upon a trivial attribute that many of these people don't even have anymore. But let's say somebody was a convicted terrorist and you wanted to take their voting away from them permanently. that would be reasonable, right? Because if they're blowing up buildings and stuff, then maybe they shouldn't vote. There's a reason for it. Now, it's not the same thing as logic, but it's still kind of connected to it. So, but to just discriminate against red-haired people, I mean, you know, the people that claim here to have had red hair in the past, they seem smart and they seem reasonable and they seem like good citizens as far as we know, right? So we wouldn't want to discriminate against these people, and we have no basis to do so. So anyway, so when I was putting this course together over the past few weeks in the midst of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, I was trying to come up with a session 1, session 2, session 3, session 4, and I thought that I would start today about the different conflicting visions of how different Israelis, different groups of Israelis, of which there are at least 4 groups, see what Israel should be. And then next time talk about religion and state in Israel, and the third session to talk about the court system, and then the final session to talk about what may happen in Israel in the future. But everything is so tied up with each other that we're going to jump around a little bit, and I think that that's okay. Now, when we announced the course in the opening press release, I was quoted as saying that it's almost unbelievable that the World Happiness Report found that Israel was the 4th happiest country in the world just a short time ago. And yet the country now appears on the verge of civil war amidst internal collapse. A country that was a stable Western-style democracy just a few months ago seems to be tottering on the edge of dictatorship. All right, so this was a little bit of an exaggeration. So I just wanted to get people excited about this course and to get them to sign up. So I don't think it's quite that bad, but it is seen in apocalyptic terms by both sides. And so the four groups that live in Israel and that are all have very different ideas of what Israel should be is, number one, is the quote-unquote secular Israeli. So secular Israel, the country was founded by quote-unquote secular Israelis. So the original Zionists were mostly socialists or communists, and they came from Russia, you know, which was very heavily imbued with socialist and communist ideologies, and they set up the kibbutzim, which were socialist/communists. And so these were people with very left-wing perspectives who wanted everything to be joint. So they wanted strong unions and health funds, and they didn't want anyone getting rich, and so they were trying to run a country on socialist standards. Golda Meir, you know, who was an American woman who became Prime Minister of Israel, she was part of that group, and so she spent some time on kibbutz, and they lived simply. You know, the leaders of the country had little apartments, and nobody had anything resembling what it is like today. And then another group eventually took over the country and sort of abolished most of the socialist institutions and introduced a much more aggressive form of capitalism, and that's when the country started to really become affluent. And then in the last 20 years, as the high tech has gone around the world, Israel has really, really benefited from that. And that's, you know, this book I don't necessarily recommend, but the title, Startup Nation, The Story of Israel's Economic Miracle, is really quite apt. And so Israel became known as a startup nation. A lot of the high-tech companies that we're familiar with worked very extensively with Israelis, including Intel, and a lot of discoveries were made in Israel about high-tech things. And so about 8% of the country has become very rich because of high-tech. So 8% of the country work in high-tech, and they're doing incredibly well. Their average salaries are at least 3 times the average salary for an upper middle class person working outside of high tech. So in other words, if you may have a good job, but if you're not in high tech, you're getting left behind. And so you can imagine the waitress or something who under the socialists was doing okay is now falling very, very far behind. And property values have gone through the roof, as you probably are aware. I remember a few years ago, I saw an ad for a real estate company said, you know, if you're an American, you want to buy an apartment in Israel, now's a great time. And so I put in, they had a machine to look for apartments, so I put in, I wasn't going to spend this amount, but just as a upper limit, $300,000, and I looked in Tel Aviv for an apartment. And Dov, how many apartments do you think I found? None. And I was shocked because it was about double or triple what I was thinking of spending, and it was really not even, even the cheapest apartment anywhere in the city, even in the slum areas, was going for about double that or more. I mean, it was just so inconceivable to me that, the prices were just in the stratosphere. So the country has done incredibly well. And if you go there as a tourist, it's just, it's still an expensive country to visit. When I went there last year, friends of mine said, now you have to take certain things, into account and not to get, and don't expect. So they said, first of all, things will be expensive. So if you go out for breakfast and it's double what it might cost in the Sun City area or more, don't get upset. You're only there for 4 or 5 weeks or whatever it was. And so you'll be able to, you just have to take that into account. But, the food will be great, hopefully, and, just don't worry about the price. And the other thing is people are still much more aggressive and almost nasty in some situations than they are here. So they said, don't take offense. That's just the way people are. And I remember when I was there many years ago, and I was waiting to get on the bus, and there was I was younger, and there was what I saw was an old person who probably was younger than I am today. And so I stood there and I figured I'll let this person go on the bus first to be polite. Well, this person did not expect that I would do that. So when the bus came, she swung her pocketbook at me to clear me away. She jumped on the bus and I'm standing there like, what happened? I was trying to be nice. And the bus driver, who is, trying to keep up with his schedule, he just pulled away and they left me here in the dust. And I was like, what just happened? So those were the two things that I had taken into account, and I did, and I had a great time. And what I didn't really investigate is the conflict in the society under the surface. So I said the first group is secular Israelis, and they're divided into two. There's the left-leaning ones and the right-leaning ones. And the left-leaning ones are influenced by the Labor Party. David Ben-Gurion was one of their founders, the socialist Zionism. On the other hand, there were the capitalist Zionists. And this was also a group that came fairly early. A lot of Polish, Jewish, middle-class business people came to Israel in the 1920s, for example. And they didn't want any part of socialism. And eventually in the 70s, they got their way, and the country became much more capitalistic than it had been before. So these two groups constitute the secular Israelis. They're not, by which I mean they're not Orthodox. The second group is the religious Zionists. And so there's a religious Zionist party that I'll talk about that's quite important. And that's not the original religious Zionists. They're much more right-wing and much more extreme than the original religious Zionists. So here you've got the older generation that have passed away in the last 20, 30 years, and the new religious Zionists. The old religious Zionists, which they had, the party was the National Religious Party, was headed by Josef Berg, who was a German Jew originally and Orthodox, but he wanted to help out the government in exchange for certain concessions to religion, and that was the deal. He said, I'll support whatever you want within reason, as long as you give money to the to the rabbinate, so you hire a lot of Orthodox rabbis to, do stuff, and you don't let the non-Orthodox, get involved in our monopoly, and you don't let buses ride on Saturday, and some of that sort of stuff. And in exchange, we'll support what you want, in terms of, policies about almost everything else. So the new generation didn't like that. They said, you basically giving in to them on almost everything, and we want to be much more aggressive. The third group is the Israeli Arabs, which is about 20% of the population. And there you can't put them all in one group, because you've got, when I traveled around the country, not this past summer, but the summer of 2022, I rented a car and I went up and down the country, and at various places I ran into Israeli Arabs. And their behavior was extremely different one from the other, ranging from really, really friendly to really, really unfriendly. And I realized that it really, there's 5 or 6 or 7 types of Israeli Arabs, and you cannot make any evaluation of them as a group. You have to find out what village are they from, what religion are they from, what background are they from. It made a huge, huge difference. So some Israeli Arabs are pretty happy in Israel. For example, some of the groups, such as the Druze, get drafted into the army, and they're quite involved, especially with the Likud party. Others, such as I went to a Arab village in the north called Jish. They're Christian Arabs, and they live in a little village that's pretty much all Christian Arabs, but they live near some Jewish areas where they have a lot of trade, and they're doing very well, and they seemed extremely happy. And then there's others who are not happy, who feel very discriminated against and not part of the country. And there's many that don't like the country, period, that want it to be destroyed. And so when did I tell this story to anyone? My cab to the train coming back this summer, and so I used the Israeli app called Get, which is like Uber, to get a taxi to the train that takes you from Jerusalem to the airport, which is a very nice train. And so you don't have to take a taxi the whole way. The previous year, I had taken a taxi the whole way back to the airport because I was leaving when President Biden was arriving. And so I was trying to get to that train, but when I was leaving, President Biden had reached Jerusalem, and police had blocked off 6 of 7 entrances to the roads to get to the central train station in Jerusalem. And the other road was so backed up because everyone was on that road. So the taxi he tried all sorts of things to get to the train station, and then he finally found the only road that would get there, and he saw the tremendous traffic, and we were driving, and you had to make a right to, bear right to go to the train station, or bear left just to go to Tel Aviv, to the actual airport. And the driver said, oh, there's a lot of traffic, but it's open. You have about 4 seconds to tell me, do you want to go to the train station or to the airport directly? And if I made the wrong decision, I was going to miss my plane. So I said, well, might as well, we'll just go straight to the airport, take our chances, and it worked out really well. But this year, I get downstairs to go taxi. It's an Israeli taxi company, but the driver is an Arab. And I'd been in with Arab taxi drivers earlier and had good experiences. And this wasn't a bad experience, but I started talking to him in Hebrew, and he answers me in English. So I figured, he thinks I'm American, that I can't speak Hebrew. So we get in the taxi, and I, figure I like to talk to people, and I've had some really good, interesting talks there. So I said, well, how long have you been a taxi driver? So he looks at me a little severely. He says, I'm not a taxi driver. So I said, well, what does that mean? Because you're driving a taxi. He says, I'm an accountant. He said, I have a degree in accounting from, he named some West Bank University. And he said, but I have to work as a taxi driver because the Israelis won't let me work as an accountant. So I said, well, why not? He said, because my West Bank University is not accredited and they won't accept it, and they won't let me sit for the CPA exam because my college wasn't accredited. So I said, well, can you do a few courses and make it up? He said, no, I have to do everything all 4 years. So I'm thinking to myself, well, you probably should have planned this better before you started and not study in a college that, you should have checked out if it's accredited. But so I didn't say that. I'm learning slowly as a rabbi to be more diplomatic. And although I really apologize to the perceived slur I made against red-haired people a few minutes ago. So I said to him, well, can't you work in a company, in a business function where you don't have to be an actual CPA, but your accounting background is important? And he said, no, I can't get that either, and so I'm driving a taxi. So so I said, all right, well, I'm just asking. So then he says, well, my family originally came from West Jerusalem, but we live in East Jerusalem now. So I went, okay, that's interesting. So they came from a little village named near Ein Kerem, which is where Hadassah Hospital is, near there. And so I said, oh, so, and as a result of the 1948 war, you ended up moving over there. So he says, yes, but I want to go back. So I said, well, I don't think the Israelis are going to let you go back. So you have to deal with reality. He says, no, I want to go back. That's my whole dream in life, is to go back. I said, well, you don't want to spend your whole life frustrated that you're trying to do something that you're not going to be able to do. So, but this went on and on like this, and so I said, well, I figured I'm there for the same $10 or $12 of the taxi ride. I might as well ask the big question. So I said to him, well, what do you suggest should be done to fix everything up here? He said, oh, it's very simple. There's one solution and one solution only. So I said, all right, what is that? He said, all the Jews have to leave and go back to where they came from. So he said, the Americans have to go back to America. I don't know if he was referring to me. And the British Jews have to go back to Britain. And then the Polish Jews have to go back to Poland. And the Yemenite Jews have to go back to Yemen. And he starts listing them. I thought to myself, the Yemenite Jews can't go back to Yemen. That's for sure. So I said, well, the Israelis are not going to agree to that. Is there a compromise that you would be willing to accept? And he said, no, there's no compromise. This is the way it has to be. So, but he was a nice guy. and he's obviously passed the security checks because he's working for an Israeli taxi company, so I wasn't worried he was going to kidnap me or anything. But his views were such as they are. And then the fourth group is the ultra-Orthodox. So the ultra-Orthodox, they don't like that term, they call themselves Haridim. Haridi means to tremble with fear. So a Haridi is somebody who trembles with fear in front of God. And this is one of the issues that's driving secular Israelis crazy, because the Haridim pay almost no taxes. They get a lot of government subsidies because of all these coalition agreements. They don't go to the army with very rare exceptions. And so they're what we would call in New York speak, schnorrers, or people who are just living off of the country. So, and you know, they don't really interact with other people in Israel. Now I have one friend who's Haredi, sort of, and I know him because we were both writing about the Jews of Cuba. So I met him not this summer but last summer, and we had lunch, and you know, it can be very friendly. But as a group, they have priorities which are vastly different from the rest of the country, and this has become a huge problem. So, and this is, Faye mentioned we're trying to put together an Israel trip for this coming May, and you know, we don't have, in the tentative itinerary, we really don't have anything, you know, to explore the Haredi areas or people, you know, and you know, you just can't take a group where the women are dressed in shorts on a short tour. It'll be a very short tour through Mea Sharim, which is one of the main ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem. But I never had any problems. So when I was living in Israel and studying, I would go to Bnei Brak, which is Haredi, and Mea Sharim area, which is Haredi, in shorts with no yarmulke, and go into bookstores, and nobody ever bothered me at all.
She was spending money.
I was spending money, and I was a boy. If I was a girl in shorts, I would have gotten spit at, you know, or something. But once I was driving on Shabbat, and I got lost, and there was a chain over the road, but you could go around the chain, and I tried to, there was only one way, not with no chain, and I drove it, and it kept bringing me back. So somehow I thought that I had to go through the road where there was the chain. So I went around the chain, and I drove about a block and a half, and then there were all these little kids, and it was Shabbat, and they didn't throw rocks at my car, but I think they threw rocks like in front of my car. And it was definitely not a warm and loving welcome. I very quickly realized my mistake, turned my car around and got out of that area. And I tried that road a fourth or fifth time that I had tried, and it hadn't led me anywhere, and miraculously it led me out. So I got there. The country in 1940 was founded in 1947 and was declared a country in 1948. And in 1948, in May, there was a Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence said that this is a Jewish democratic country. So it said both Jewish and democratic. And later this became a question, how can it be Jewish and democratic? If it's democratic, you know, the majority vote for what they want. So how can you pre-assume that it's going to be Jewish? And that it will give equal rights to all. So equal rights to all. If we ask Leonard, he'll give you a few definitions of what equal rights for all probably mean. And But in reality, that isn't necessarily the way things worked out. Different groups in the coalition government get different benefits based upon the political parties that they vote for. So it's like a pie, and there's different political parties that run for Knesset, and that because of the coalition agreements, each party carves out as much of the pie as they can for their constituents, who vote for them not because they think this is good ideas or bad ideas, but because these are the people that represent their group. So, for example, if you're Haredi, there's a couple of political parties that represent you, and they will make sure that Haredi men can get a subsidy to study in yeshiva. So this is why I'm announcing today that I'm going to become Haredi and move to Israel. I can study full-time and get paid. But I'm not making that announcement because the subsidy is only $300 a month, and I decided that that wouldn't be enough budget to buy enough ice cream. So $300 a month doesn't sound like very much, but when you have tens and tens of thousands of such people, it's a lot of money for the state budget. And in addition, there's other benefits that they get, and so they're getting a lot more than $300 a month. So how does the average Haredi live? So he studies in yeshiva all day, every day, and he gets his $300 a month stipend, but he also slips out and does some gray work, under the table work. So maybe he'll repair refrigerators for cash, maybe he'll do some tax returns, whatever it is, they do different work, quietly, for which they do not report the income and don't pay taxes on that, in large part. And then the wife works. But how does the wife work when they have 8 or 10 or 12 kids? That's something that I couldn't even begin to speculate on. But when the state started in 1948, there were very few Haredim. Many of the socialists thought that they were an anachronism. They certainly appear to be an anachronism. In the 20th century, 1948, how do you still have people that wear these black hats and white shirts? And I mean, they're dressing like they're in Poland in the 18th century, but they're in Israel in the 20th century. So people thought, give them a couple years, they'll disappear on their own. But they didn't disappear. So originally Ben-Gurion agreed to exempt 400 yeshiva bachers from the army, 400. Now the number is up to 100,000 or 200,000 or some huge number. And this happened because when Menachem Begin took over in the 70s, he agreed as part of his coalition agreement with the Haredi parties to eliminate the ceiling on the number of Haredi men who were exempted from the army. So up until then, there was a ceiling of how many Haredim could be exempted. So the yeshivas had to say, who are our best students? And these 400 or whatever 100 students will give them exemption. But everyone else was not exempted. Now, anybody who claimed to be a full-time yeshiva student could get fully exempted from the army. So you can imagine the resentment that creates on the other side. So, but what has happened in the last year to make things so tense? And the answer is the new government. So as you know, that starting about 5 years ago, there was a series of elections in Israel which led to kind of no result. And so there was a series of short-lived governments which were founded. And you remember there's how many in the Knesset?
120.
And so how many you need to form a government?
61.
Good. But if you have 61 and let's say 2 of them go on a vacation to Siberia, How many do you have voting for your coalition? 59 out of 120, and you may not get your majority. So you can't let anyone go on vacation to Siberia when there's an important vote. But let's say one of those 61 says, well, I want more. I want more from my people. I want, I represent this kind of group, and I want more. And so, and then you give them a little more, and they say, I want more. I mean, at some point you might want to say, enough, stop. And that person might say, I'll quit the coalition. I'll jump to the opposition, or I'll just abstain. And then the whole coalition falls apart. And that's what happened over and over and over. And so then finally, this past election saw a decisive result. And the only reason it saw a decisive result because the voters in Israel are split almost 50-50, is because the head of the Labor Party, a woman named Michaeli, she refused to enter into a vote-sharing agreement with other secular parties. So basically, if you get a certain number of votes, you get a certain number of Knesset members. So I forget the exact number, but if you have excess votes, but not enough for another Knesset member, those votes are, quote unquote, wasted. But you can share them with other parties. So you can lend your votes or give your votes to another party, and they can use what they already have, plus yours, to get another member of Knesset elected. But if you don't sign an agreement, then it won't happen. So she refused to sign an agreement because she wanted to build a more unique identity for the Labor Party. And as a result, one or more of the other similar parties fell below the voting threshold, and they didn't get anybody elected. So between their party and her party, there was hundreds of thousands of votes wasted. And that made the difference between basically a 60-60 split or a 61-59 split and what happened, which was the governing coalition ended up with 64 out of 120, which is, in Israeli terms, a huge majority. And so under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he was able to put together this current coalition. But he could only put it together by using very, very right-wing parties and very, very Haredi parties. So it's by far the most right-wing / Haredi / Orthodox in the history of the State of Israel. I believe that the majority of the cabinet members are Orthodox. And in Israel, to be Orthodox is to be pretty much right-wing. So both in political terms and in religious terms, they're far more extreme than anything Israel has ever seen. And they're far more secure than any of the previous governments have been for at least the previous 5 years and maybe much more. So that's the situation. And so then the government had a minister of justice who's the head lawyer essentially, and the deputy prime minister was a man called Levine, and he said, we're going to do a judicial reform. And that's where this whole thing started from. And so Yariv Levine is a son of Aryeh Levine, who was an Israel Prize laureate in linguistics. So his parents were very, very bright. But his mother's uncle was the commander of the Altalena ship. And so I'm going to tell you the story of the Altalena because it shows you that this grudge or this conflict between the current group and the previous group goes back at least 75 years. Has anyone ever heard of the Altalena? So the Altalena, you've heard of the Altalena, okay. And so the Altalena is a boat. And it was in the British Mandate period, there were a number of different Jewish militias that were trying to fight for independence and trying to build up their own power base. And one of them was the Irgun. The Irgun was a more right-wing group, and many of the current government members are descendants, either literally or, or in terms of their political beliefs, of the earlier Irgun people. So anyway, the Irgun had made a deal with the French. The French donated 153 million francs worth of military equipment. Now, why would the French give so much military equipment to the Irgun? Well, the different countries were thinking, well, Israel's going to come into being, and we want influence. So the French thought, we'll give this military equipment to the Irgun. If they come to power, then they're going to come, owe us a big debt because we gave them all this military equipment. So that was apparently what their foreign minister was thinking. So they gave them 153 million francs, whatever that was worth. It's a lot of military equipment. And they got a boat, big storage boat, cargo boat called the Altalena. And they also put about 900 immigrants who were going to come in as fighters into the War of Independence, which was about to break out, on the boat. And the commander was a man called Eliyahu Lankin, whose great nephew is Levine, who's now the Minister of Justice pushing through the judicial reform measures. Anyway, so the boat takes off from France, and it's heading toward Israel. And meanwhile, Ben-Gurion and the Palmach, which is was the main Jewish paramilitary group, is trying to merge all of the other military groups into one command because they want one army for one country, right? You can't have everyone having their private militias. Well, Menachem Begin refused. They were negotiated, and they said, well, you can take 20% of the equipment for a group that is Irgun, that's fighting in Jerusalem. This is right after the first ceasefire, so the War of Independence had already started. But the rest of the 80% we the Palmach, are taking for the future Israeli army. And Begin said no, he wanted some of that to go to other Irgun groups that would keep them separate groups. So Ben-Gurion, there was rumors that this was part of the plan of the Irgun to have a overthrow, to forcibly, take control of the new country. And they weren't going to allow that. So Ben-Gurion said, if you don't agree to do what we tell you in terms of this arms, we'll attack the boat. So that's what happened. The boat landed, and they started unloading it, and then the negotiations broke down, and the boat pulled off, and Ben-Gurion said, shoot the boat. And so they shot at the boat, and then the boat moved up it was going to land in one place, and then it landed in another. And anyway, there was a couple of different battles about this boat between the Jewish militia, founded by the Irgun, and by the Palmach, the main Jewish military group. And at the end of it, there was something like 14 soldiers killed on both sides, and the boat went on fire, and eventually they left it there on the beach for about a year, and then they hauled it offshore and sunk it a year later. And so it was almost a civil war, and nobody really knows to this day if this was just a failed negotiation or if the Irgun was really planning a military coup. So with that, I'll say that this fighting going on now is, in my view, a direct continuation of the fighting which got to the point 75 years ago of an actual military fight between these two groups, and this could happen again. People are talking about a civil war, and I don't think they mean it only metaphorically. So under the surface, this has been throughout the whole history of Israel, but if you go there as a tourist, you wouldn't notice any of this. And so with that, I'll take some comments or questions. Okay.
Thank you. So, who are into what category are today's Irgun of the four that you mentioned?
Likud, the secular, under the secular, there's two groups. There's the left-wing and the right-wing secularists. These are the right-wing secularists. And that's the Likud party, which is headed by none other than Benjamin Netanyahu. And they're now being encouraged by other parties that have similar affinities. And the people demonstrating against the judicial reforms are people that their great-grandparents were part of the Palmach, part of the establishment Israel, which were the more socialist-oriented, or more, in today's terms, more liberal. Nobody talks about socialism anymore, but they do talk about, for example, gay rights has become, like in some American religious contexts, the issue of gay rights has assumed much greater importance than it would seemingly have, because it symbolizes your attitude toward things. And behind it all is a certain sense that the two groups have very different plans for the West Bank, what is traditionally, historically called Judea, which is the area around Jerusalem, and Samaria, which was the northern area, which was run by the Samaritans for a while.
Okay, the issue with the Israeli, with the reform is...
Hold it closer to...
Reasonable. Here's my question. Haredim are exempted from the army. Is that reasonable?
Well, that's why the right-wing groups want to take this away from the Supreme Court.
Has anyone ever challenged that? Has anyone
ever
challenged the Haredim? And what's the court said?
Well, the court sides with the secularists and say that the Supreme Court over the past 20 years has made a series of rulings that are against the right-wing group, that they've stood up in favor of equal rights for Arabs, equal rights for gays, against giving preference to the Haredim, and then the governments have generally worked to get around these court rulings, but the court has served as a tremendous force for what we might call liberalism. So the court has done a lot, but the governments have been able to get around a lot of these things. But if the judicial reform goes through, then they won't need to get around them, because the court won't have any power to.
So the Haredim still fighting are they still exempt from the army, the Haredim today?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And that's hundreds of thousands of men. So there are voluntary groups that go in. There's a few Haredim that voluntarily go into the army, but it's voluntary. And the previous government under Prime Ministers Bennett and then Lapid, if you remember, there was a rotation agreement, and that was, in my view, the best government Israel had had in a very, very long time, if maybe ever. But they were planning to try to revoke this, at least in part, but their coalition fell apart, due to pressure from the right. Yes, Richard.
This is more of a comment than a question. I read the other day the Wall Street Journal article by Michael Oren. I don't know if everybody knows.
Yes, Michael Oren is an American, originally moved to Israel, and he served as the Israeli ambassador to Washington for quite a while.
Right.
He's also written some very well-regarded books.
Right. The article mentions the Yom Kippur War, which began October 6th, 1976, I think?
1973.
73.
50 years, 50 years ago.
His comment about what's happening today is that when the war started, the populace lost their confidence in their leadership because it was a surprise. And that with that, labor lost to Likud. It has never really recovered. And so it's his take that the war in 1973 was the beginning of the end that we're seeing today.
Yeah, I think that is probably true. As you know, in the 6-Day War, Nasser of Egypt closed the Strait of Tiran to Israeli shipping and threatened to attack Israel and destroy the country. And then Israel, before the Egyptians could attack, they sent their air force and they basically destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground and the airstrips on the ground, and Israel won a tremendous victory in 6 days, the 6-Day War. But in 73, for reasons I still don't understand, because there was an Egyptian spy that told the Israelis that the Egyptians were going to attack. There was, King Hussein of Jordan told the Israelis that the Egyptians were going to attack, and they could see the troop movements. So how they didn't understand this, I still don't understand. But the head of military intelligence kept insisting that the Arabs would not attack. And Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, supported this guy and said, "I trust him." And Golda Meir refused to overrule Dayan because she had no military experience, and she felt he's the expert, and if the Minister of Defense says something, you don't just do something else, because, you know, who is she to overrule him? And so it was really a tremendous unnecessary catastrophe, and thousands of Israeli soldiers were killed, and they almost lost the war. And Kissinger, interestingly, who in most views held back shipments from Israel, is now claiming in a recent interview that he did everything he could to help Israel. In the popular scenario at the time, Kissinger was trying to hurt Israel, and Golda Meir called President Nixon directly, and it was President Nixon who authorized the tremendous shipment of arms. Also, they found out once the war started that a lot of the supplies that the Israeli army had in the storage units were no good, that they were so old that they were useless. So nobody had checked on any of this stuff beforehand. So it was really tremendous incompetence, and if you were an Israeli after that, you would not trust your government leaders. And these were the labor leaders. These were, in the terms I said, the secularists, but from the left side. And so ever since then, nobody's really trusted the left leaders. And now it's interesting because the fight over judicial reform is partly led by left-wing people, but it's partly not left-wing people. It's partly people who are fairly middle of the road or even right-wing in terms of Palestinian issues, but on this issue, they're in favor, obviously, of what you would call democracy. There's also a big debate over what it means, democracy, because the right wing, the Likud voters, say, well, we won. We won 64 out of 120 in a fair and square election. So if democracy is just about who gets the most votes, and then the government can do anything that the voters want because the majority vote a certain way, that's one definition of democracy. But another definition of democracy is protection for the minority, right? So even though it's a democracy and 61 or 68 or 74% of people want X, you still have certain safeguards which are basically ensured by having an independent Supreme Court, which can make rulings not based on what the majority want, but by what can protect the minority in a democratic society. So there's very different definitions of what democracy is.
Okay, I'm going back to 1948. I read yesterday in the New York Times, there's an article on Netanyahu. It said there's no constitution in Israel. I didn't know that. Maybe others probably know that. I didn't know that. So I'm wondering, did these four factions maybe prevent them from creating? They couldn't get along.
Exactly. Well, it was primarily the Orthodox, right? Because the Orthodox said the Torah is our constitution, and we want a constitution that will acknowledge that Orthodox Judaism is the foundational value system of the state. And obviously the secularists, both right and left, were against that. So it was actually an American conservative rabbi living in Israel who came up with the key to it. So the Orthodox wanted the Declaration of Independence to say, you know, we believe in the one true God. And the secularists, some of them were atheists. So they came up with an expression which is from the Bible, which said, "O Rock of Israel." And so Rock of Israel in the Torah refers to God. But in the Declaration of Independence, it could just refer to a rock, you know, like, so they put that expression in. The Orthodox said, okay, you've mentioned God. The secularists said, no, we haven't mentioned God, so we're okay. But the Declaration of Independence, as I said earlier, it said you should have a country where everyone has equality before the law, and everyone is equal, and everyone has rights. And so these are liberal principles which the people fighting against this judicial reform are calling on. But they never made a constitution, but they did do basic laws. And so we'll talk about that more in the coming weeks, and Leonard may have something to say about that. But basic laws were laws that were considered to be foundational and were hopefully going to become the core of a future constitution. And so there are basic laws to this day, and the Knesset can pass new basic laws. And one of the things that the current government wants to do is to prevent the Supreme Court from nullifying basic laws. So if the Knesset says this is a new basic law, that red-headed people can't vote, or people who used to have red hair can't vote, then that would not be subject to oversight from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court thinks that's a very bad idea, especially with a basic law, but with any law, they feel that they have a right and an obligation to look at it and say, no, that contradicts the sense, in the Declaration of Independence where it says everyone is equal. So if everyone's equal, then all citizens have a right to vote unless there's some mitigating circumstance, such as, let's say, terrorism. But just because they have red hair doesn't mean that they shouldn't vote. One last question. Okay.
I can just, yeah. How are judges on the Supreme Court in Israel selected?
Say it again so everyone can hear.
How are the judges in the Israeli Supreme Court selected?
Ah, very good. And that's another change that they want to make in the judicial reform, as you might imagine. So right now there's a committee, not just for the Supreme Court, but for a lot of judges, where there's a group of judges and a group of people from the Bar Association and a group of people from the Knesset and a couple of other groups. So there's a committee that is appointed from 4, 5, or 6 different places. And so to pick a Supreme Court justice, they basically have to work by consensus, because you need 7 out of 9 votes to pick somebody. And there's 3 representatives from the government and 3 representatives from the judges So if either the government or the judges don't like somebody, and the 3 of them from that group vote against it, then you only have 6 votes. So you have to find people that are minimally acceptable to to different groups. So the current system is one of checks and balances. The government wants to do away with that so that the majority of people on these appointment committees would come from the government, and therefore the government could pick any judge they want. So that would almost immediately change the types of judges you're getting, and it would change the nature of the country. Now I did, just to close, I did tell the board here that if they asked me to be either Prime Minister of Israel or the head of the Supreme Court, that I would take a leave of absence, and that I would imagine that I wouldn't be able to handle the politics there very well, and I should be back within several months. Okay, well that's enough for today, so I'll see you all next week. If you want to talk to me, I'm up here, so please feel free to come forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi.